Hey, if this is your first time with us or you've been gone for a little while, we are actually in the midst of a 60-day experiment, something we're calling 60-60. A chance this summer to experience God in a different way than you have before. And here's the basic premise of this whole thing. The idea is that you have a phone or a pad or your computer and you set it up that it has a beep, and it beeps once every hour. And when the beep happens, this is what we've been asking people to have happen. To allow the interruption of that beep to be your invitation to include God in your life. That's it. Nothing more. Don't have to stop and pray. Don't have to consider, going a long list. It's just simply as you're in the midst of a discussion, you're in the midst of your work, you're in the midst of relaxing, you're in the midst of watching some TV, reading the newspaper, whatever you're doing, driving down the road, just allow that interruption of that beep to be your invitation to allow God to come into your life. And it's been kind of neat the last couple of weeks as people have been talking to me, kind of saying what's been going on when the beep happens. More often than not, what I'm discovering is people are saying, Mike, it seems like it beeps at the most inopportune time. This week I was having a discussion with one of my coworkers, and we were trying to, we're kind of getting heated on it, and just that we're getting heated, boom, a beep happens. And they said, maybe kind of stop and to think. And the reality is that conflict happens, doesn't it? It's sort of the story of life. And I don't necessarily believe that all conflict is bad. I think conflict can be a positive thing for us. It can be part of human nature and the human experience. But what I have discovered is that we live in this world of conflicting kingdoms with conflicting desires. And that's where a lot of this conflict happens. And I don't know how often you've ever said this statement. I have oftentimes thought this, something's going on, I'm watching some people do something or talking to some people, and through my mind goes this one statement. What in the world is wrong with these people? Anybody else ever had that question? It's amazing, isn't it? A couple weeks ago, I had the privilege of being on jury duty. And it was actually, I was excited because I was hoping I would actually get to be. I've been close before, but I've never had that. And I always thought that would just be sort of round up my experience, like to understand the judicial system a little bit more. I've done it now, and I don't have any desire to go back to do it again. But it was funny. We got there and, sat there for a couple hours, and bing, my number went off. And so we went down to this room, went up to the courtroom, and sat there, and the judge kind of came out, and they made all these questions, and they kind of narrowed us down to this group, and they picked a bunch of us, and then we got seated right before lunch, and they let the attorneys do their opening statements, and basically the first attorney got up and said, this is a very simple case. We all agree on the facts. It's just about, what's going to happen from it, and that, it was honest, that's what it was. And so we got done, went to lunch, we came back, the plaintiff's attorney got up, called the first witness, which happened to be one of the people for the defense. That was the plaintiff's first witness. Second witness was the plaintiff himself. Got done, went to the defense. The defense did not call any witnesses, didn't make any statements, and it was time now to go to us. And it was about 3:30, 4 o'clock, and I thought, man, we can finish this up in one day, and I can get back to work. I got all my stuff piling up. And you know what the judge said? It's getting kind of late, and we want to give you some time, and so come back tomorrow. So I thought of all the stuff that I got to, read in my schedule, get all this kind of stuff. So I thought, but hey, I was hoping, in fact, I got home, and you're not supposed to talk about the case, and I didn't. I just kind of told Lori, I wish they would have given us, because it was a very simple case. It was very clear what had happened. It seemed pretty obvious, who was at fault here. Well, I think we could have finished it up in an hour and a half, and been done. But no, the judge in their wisdom said, go home. So the next day I got over there at 8:30, went into the courtroom. The judge kind of said, okay, well, we're going to give closing arguments. Here's the closing arguments. You go back in the room. And I thought, hey, I'm still okay. I'll get out by lunchtime, and in my afternoon will get filled up, and I can do all the stuff that I haven't been able to do yesterday. And we got in that back room, and the foreman took a vote real quickly. How many, think this way, how many think that way? And we were split right down the middle. And the thought that popped in my mind was, what in the world is wrong with these people? It was a very simple case. There was a hole in the ground at a bus center, and the county had not replaced the tree that went in that hole. And apparently the hole had sat there for at least 2 or 3 years. Nobody had any records of how long it had been there. They knew at some time there was a tree, and there was no longer any tree. This little lady comes walking along. She's looking for a cab. She's walking along. She trips in the hole. She falls down. She dislocates her thumb. She gets all banged up. It seemed pretty straightforward to me, but it wasn't. We had lunch that day on the county. We almost had dinner that day on the county until they finally got their minds around what they should have known all along, at least from my perspective. But isn't it amazing how conflict just kind of seems to center on so many things in life? In fact, today we're going to look at what I believe is the one reason you and you and you and I experience conflict. And it's actually based on this amazing statement that James writes in the book of James. And before we get there, I want to invite you just to bow your heads for a moment before we kind of delve into it today, all right? Lord, we all know that conflict happens to us. And we know that at times it just stirs us up. And I'm thankful for those moments that you break into those situations to simply remind us of your presence, to help us sort of re-engage with you and hopefully re-engage with the people or the person that we're sort of in conflict with at the moment. But today I pray that you would be clear with us so that we in turn can be clear with you. And that you would speak to us so that in turn we can speak to you and in reality speak for you on occasions. So be just with us today and move in this place in your name. Amen. You know that whole question of what's the matter with people, Jeremiah chapter 17, if you've been around a church very much in your life, you have probably heard this passage. And it simply says this: more than anything else, a person's heart is deceitful, that is devious, that it's crooked, and cannot be healed. It's desperately wicked. It's sick. So what's wrong with these people? Same thing happens to be wrong with you. The same thing that's happened wrong with me. It's our hearts are our issue. They are, as it says, they're deceitful, they're crooked, they're really sick. And you know this from your own experience. How many of you have ever fallen in love with somebody and they didn't fall in love with you back? Raise your hands. I know some of you aren't raising your hands, and I know, yeah, there we go, all right. Right? Your heart deceived you. How many of you ever been in love with somebody you never even met? You know, some movie star or rock star? Yeah, okay, that's it, yeah. But man, it's real. Don't tell me it's not real, you know, and we just go, oh, you know, and that's just one example. We're not going to go any farther, but that's just a clear example to all of us, that our hearts are deceitful. They're kind of sick and twisted. They don't always get stuff right. And in fact, Jeremiah finishes by saying, who can understand and know it? And the heart is a hard thing to understand, because sometimes you can't control where your heart goes. Sometimes your heart makes you think certain things or believe certain things. And here's the reality I want you simply to write down in your outline. All of us have a heart problem. And that's important to know. Because it's not just what's wrong with those people, it's what's wrong with these people. And if we know that we all have this heart issue, it will help us better understand what's going on in our lives and what I believe what God hopes will happen in our lives. So here's the real reason. There's one thing at the heart of every conflict. So for a moment, just kind of humor me for a second. I want you to think of your most recent conflict. Make it a juicy one, all right? You know, what's your most recent kind of argument? Maybe it was what we like to call around our house a passionate discussion. We don't argue, we just have passionate discussions, you know. But I want you to think about it. Just think for a moment, kind of think about who it was with, what's going on. You know, if they're sitting next to you today, it's okay to take your arm down from them and cross your arms, because I want you to feel it. I want you to get it. I want you to get the picture in your mind of your most recent thing. Maybe it was with your parent. Maybe it was with your kid. Maybe it was with your spouse, your neighbor, your coworker, your boss, that knucklehead on the road, yesterday, whatever. Get that picture in mind when you had sort of this conflict and you were just mad about it, all right? You got that picture in your mind? Just a minute. We're going to look at the reason, the one thing that is the heart of every conflict, was the heart of that conflict and every other conflict you've had in your life. And I know that's a big, big statement to make. Oh, I got the answer for everything. But I think when we get done, you're going to agree that this is the one thing that's at the heart of every conflict. And it has a lot to do with you. But let's look and see what James says over in James chapter 4. This is from the Voice Bible. It's a brand new, or a fairly new Bible that sort of puts things in a little modern language. I took it today just because I love the way he captures it. James says, listen, where do you think your fighting and endless conflict come from? Because we have that. We have this fighting and endless conflict. Even when we go smooth for a while, at some point, something pops up. It just keeps going on. Where does it come from? Don't you think that they originate in the constant pursuit of gratification that rages inside each of you like an uncontrolled militia? Kind of scary words, isn't it? The uncontrolled militia, But it doesn't seem like that at times. This stuff pops up out of nowhere, like this, terrorist that pops up and kind of boom, hits you and then runs away. And he goes on and says, listen, you crave something that you do not possess, so you murder to get it. And you may be at the moment checking out and saying, oh, come on, Mike, I've never killed anybody. But remember Jesus' definition of what it means to kill somebody. You ever told some stories about somebody else? Kind of murdered their reputation? Maybe you've given the facts, just maybe not all the facts. Or said the facts in a way that just kind of gave an impression some way. You crave something that you don't possess, so you do something about it, James says. You desire the things you cannot earn, so you sue others and you fight for what you want. You do not have because you've chosen not to ask. And he's talking about here to praying about to God. But you don't have because you've chosen not to ask. And part of the reason is we don't really want to complicate God, or maybe we're not even sure God cares about this, or we don't really want to hear from God in this. We just want to get what we want here. Or he says, and when you do ask, you still do not get what you want because your motives are all wrong. Just because you ask God doesn't mean he's going to come through, because sometimes we're messed up in those things. Because you continually focus on self-indulgence. And he says those three words, you are adulterers. And he's not talking in the traditional sense of adultery here. He's talking in this idea of being unfaithful to God. Unfaithful to God in the way that we handle our lives, the way we handle conflict. The way when we don't get what we want, how we go about trying to get what we want, even though we know we shouldn't probably have that, but we still really want to have it. We find ourselves there with this real reason that I think is behind every conflict. And that's you're not getting what you want. Let that sink in for a moment. Think of that last conflict we talked about just a few moments ago. You wanted him to do this. You wanted her to stop doing that. You wanted them to love you, to respect you, to care about you, to do their job, to fix the thing. Isn't your conflict really about getting what you want? And the reason you had conflict is you weren't getting it. And so you kept at the conflict. In fact, if you're sitting here right at this moment thinking, oh no, Mike, you got this all wrong. My last conflict had nothing to do with getting what I wanted. And you just can't wait till I get done today so you can catch me out in the hallway to correct me. And you're a little, hoping that happens quick, because the reason you're agitated is you want something. You want me to understand that you're the exception to the rule. And you're bothered by the fact that I won't give you credit for being the exception to the rule. So you're not getting what you want. But think about it. The last big conflict, even the little one. The guy that cut you off on your way to work this week, who kind of was a multiple amputee apparently when he waved back at you, And you got mad. There was conflict that stirred up. You didn't get what you want. You didn't get your chance to respond in the way you wanted to. You didn't get the chance just to drive to work in peace without any kind of thing happening. It really all comes back to not getting what you want. And that's what James says there. Don't you know where all this comes from? We always think it's everybody else's fault. Everybody else's problem. And the reality is, even when it is somebody else's problem, let's say it's, I don't believe anything's ever 100% somebody's fault, but let's say it's 99.9% somebody else's fault. Your 0.1% is simply that you were in the room at the same time, all right? Even if somebody's at 99.9% at fault, isn't the reason you have conflict? that you're not getting what you want. I want you to be at peace. I want to be left alone. I don't want to be sucked into this thing. It really comes back to ourselves and our issues and all the stuff that revolves around us. The reality is we were created for a loving relationship with God and others. Jesus goes over this again and again. He says, greatest commandment, it's really two parts. It's loving God with everything. And it's loving the people around us like we care for ourselves. That's really the whole thing. We were created for this loving relationship, not just with God, but with God and others. And the problem is we live in a world of conflicting kingdoms with conflicting desires. I want my stuff. You want your stuff. And now we have stuff. I saw a quote a couple weeks ago that was fitting for this. Frederick Buechner, who's an American writer, theologian, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is the most fun. And you think about it. In fact, I got his whole quote here so that I get it correctly. Of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. To lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come. To savor to the last toothsome morsel both the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, it is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you're wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at your feast is you. Interesting take by this guy who's always kind of got some very pithy statements. But it really is kind of the most fun to get angry about something and to vent and to kind of get it out because we're trying to get what we want, and if we haven't been able to get what we want, it's a way to process getting what we want. But here's the bottom line, is according to James. You may think the situation is hopeless. And if my heart's deceitful and wicked and corrupt and hurt and needs healing and is broken, and yours is as well, is there really any hope for things to get fixed out? You may think the situation is hopeless, James writes, but God gives us more grace when we turn away from our own interests. In fact, just before this, he talks about, we kind of get sucked up into how our culture deals with things, and we kind of begin to buy that kind of processing. And James says, listen, you can feel like this is how it happens. This is how you get things fixed. This is how conflicts go, and this is how you try to work out conflicts here in our society. And James says, hold it here. It can seem hopeless because this is what's going on. But the fact that God gives not just grace, but more grace when we turn away from our own interest. When we don't always have to have our way in things. I have seen more relationships destroyed in my life over somebody wanting to be right more than having the relationship restored. I've ruined some relationships because I'm going to be right. And when I think I'm right, I will go and go and go and go to make sure that everybody knows that I'm right. Because that's what I need. That's what I want. I will even take arguments. Sometimes I'll have an argument with Lori. Partway through the argument, I'll recognize that I am on the wrong side of this argument. But I won't tell her I'm on the wrong side of the argument. I'll just try to figure out other ways to explain it, to twist around, to get where I want to be, because I want to get what I want. It's to feel good about myself, even if I'm not right in that process. And I need this idea of more grace. That'll turn me, when I turn away from my own interest, when I recognize that's not the best way and most healthy way to live, that God steps in and gives us more grace. That's why James writes that Scripture says God opposes the proud, but he pours out grace on the humble. And that's a hard thing to understand. God opposes the proud because there's things that we're proud of in our lives. Things that we would say, you ought to be proud of that. Great accomplishment, and it's easy to kind of get sucked in. I'm a child of the king. Sometimes we go that way. I'm a child of the king. We're going to roll the house because I'm proud of that. But there's this piece of being humble, and the problem with being humble is that it makes us feel vulnerable. But James will remind us that's what the Bible says. And it's who God pours out his grace to. Those that are most vulnerable. Those who are most open to what God's trying to do. So James concludes by simply saying, listen, so we got to submit ourselves to the one true God and fight against the devil and his schemes. Because the devil's ultimate goal is to break down that relationship between us and God and us and other people. And you cannot separate those two as much as we wish we could. Because me and God are okay. It's me and some other people. That's good. And over we're reminded that we can't separate them. Jesus says you can't separate those two things. If you got problems this way, you really have problems this way, even though you think everything's good this way, and not so good this way. So what can we do? 3 quick things today. Number 1, I need to recognize my part and heart. That when I run into conflict, when things aren't going well, that I have a part and I have a heart in this. And I do recognize that my heart isn't always pure. And I have a part in every conflict. One of the things I do with premarital counseling, even marriage counseling, is that I have these 10 steps that I've been doing for a lot of years. And it's universally the thing that people come back and say, that's the one best thing that you did for us. So I'm glad I had one good thing. It's something that did for them, you know? But they say the basic thing is that there's no your problem and the other person's problem. It's not one or the other. It's your problem together. It's our problem. And everybody is guilty of something in it, and everybody has part of the solution to it. So there isn't, well, the problem is you're just a lazy bum and now you need to get a job. That may be true. But the other person has contributed to that. And how we humans are wired sometimes, say the guy's kind of a lazy bum, and the wife likes to continually remind him that he's a lazy bum, which makes the guy more lazy because he's not going to give her the satisfaction. He's going to follow what she says. It's an our problem, not a his problem, not a her problem. And in every conflict we have, I need to recognize my part and my heart in it. Number 2, I need to choose to believe the best. One of my frustrations is always when people jump to conclusions, and we all do this. We all connect dots that aren't necessarily need to be connected, but because we're judging from our experience, we kind of say, yeah, that's what happened. Oh, yes, and we right away jump to the worst possible scenario. And I believe we ought to believe the best until proven otherwise, and proven otherwise means I've actually gone and talked to the person who I'm beginning not to believe the best about and let them have an explanation, find out from them versus find out from everybody else. Yeah. Because it is always, how many of you always enjoy the end of being on that somebody has believed the worst about you? Nobody's going to raise their hand today? Right? Nobody. Everybody wants somebody to believe the best because oftentimes it's not a matter of somebody was doing something intentionally. It's just they ran unawares or they weren't figuring out what was going on at that moment. 3rd thing, I ought to respond to God's direction and his presence. And that's really what this beep is about, is allowing God to interrupt my life and make that invitation to invite him into it. Where at that moment I say, oops, God, you're here. I respond to your presence, but I'm also going to respond to your direction. And here's God's very clear direction. John chapter 13. Jesus says, a new command I give you. Love one another. Let me ask you a very deep theological question this morning. Why does Jesus have to command us to love other people? Why does it go to the level of a command? From my perspective, it just tells me that it's not the normal thing. It's not the easiest thing. Sometimes we need to follow through with it. How many of you remember being a child and you did something you weren't supposed to do and you're supposed to say you're sorry and you're not really sorry at the moment, but your parents said, say you're, right? And your parents are smart people. They knew by just saying you're sorry wasn't going to make you sorry, but they were trying to instill in you something very important. to get your conscience to be stirred up a little bit. And in that moment, you weren't sorry. And by saying, I'm sorry. Say it louder. I'm sorry. For them, it wasn't the emotion at the moment. It was the proper step at the moment. It was the owning up, and it was trying to get you to respond that there are things that you ought to be sorry for, and you ought to respond in some way to saying you're sorry. And when Jesus says, this is a new command, I'm going to command you to do this, you need to know that this is important, and sometimes you have to just do it. Do it not because you want to do it, but you have to do it, but it's in the process of it to be reminded again that this is not a natural, normal thing for us. What's natural, normal is to love the people that love us and to hate the people that hate us. To like the people that we don't want to like and to dislike the people that may want to like us, but we don't want to like them. And Jesus then will speak about this idea of God's presence in our life. It gives us the ability not just to follow the command, but to somehow experience the command. When he finishes this by saying, by this idea of loving one another, everyone will know that you are my disciples. And Jesus knows. Jesus knows that he cannot force anybody to love anybody. But he can remind us of the power of love and the power of his presence in our lives to create love when there is no love, to create connection when there is no connection, and the power that will be not only in our lives, but to other people as they look on. So what if? What if how I get along with people in my life, my spouse, my kids, my coworkers, my boss, my neighbors, you go down the list and the list and the list and the in-laws, outlaws, all those kind of things. What if how I get along with the people in my life is the whole purpose of my life? See, sometimes we want to find a purpose in our life, God put me on this planet to do this or to do that. But what if your whole purpose and my whole purpose is how we get along with the people that God has blessed us with in our lives? So let me ask you as we kind of close this morning, and I hope you've been part of this, having the beep go off. If you haven't, you still got some time, you can do it for a few more weeks with us. Set it once an hour, a beep. If you can't be in a place that has a beep, put little notes that every time you see the note, you stop. You may stop more than an hour, that's fine. But allow God to interrupt your life, to remind you of the starting reality that God is already there and is always there. It's more about our awareness than him showing up. But what is it? What is it that God is trying to do in your life right at this moment? Because there's an answer in your life for that question. Some of you, it comes right away. For others of you, it begins to flicker and you kind of flip that switch off because you don't want to deal with it. You know what he's trying to do, but you don't want to go there. And I would simply appeal to you this afternoon or this morning that you be willing to simply respond to his presence. Even if it's a scary thing that says, I know what you're trying to do and I don't really want to go there, that's fine. Even just saying that to God, I know what you're trying to do, is a recognition of his, not only his presence, but his direction for your life. And I think with recognition comes great opportunities. So what is it? What is it that God's trying to do in your life? And I believe it has something to do with how you treat those around you, those that God has placed in your life. Pastor Jason talked before about that Connect card. I invite you to take that out right now. And on the back of it, there's some possible next steps. Each week we want to give you a chance to sort of take a step in your experience with God. Some of these may work for you, some of them may not work, but I'm just going to walk 4 possible next steps. Maybe your next step day is to keep staying connected to God every 60 minutes for the next 46 days. That's how much longer we have now. It's roughly 6 weeks. So maybe you're kind of been doing it. Maybe it's not been perfect. Nobody's expecting perfection in this. All I'm asking you is give it a try and keep allowing that interruption to be an invitation to God night. Maybe your next step today is to rethink your conflicts in light of what we've talked about today. Maybe to rethink of, really, is that really true about these conflicts? And begin to see if what James says is not true. That your conflicts are really about what you're trying to get. Maybe your next step today is to seek to see your relationships in a different way. Begin to see, the stuff that the people that God has put in there as your purpose in life and how you relate to it. Maybe your next step is to ask God to make you more loving towards those around you. Whatever our next step opportunity is, I hope you take some kind of step with God today. Even if it's a little small step. Because every step with God is a step in the right direction.